The Vatican was supposed to be the holiest place on earth, but behind its marble walls, shadows whispered another story. Locked doors, strange laughter echoing where prayers should have been, servants carrying trays not of holy bread and wine, but of forbidden luxuries no one dared write about openly. Some called it politics, others called it madness, and a few, too bold for their own safety, wrote one word in their chronicles: orgies. The kind so scandalous that later popes ordered the records destroyed. But the truth never really disappears. History remembers, even when the Church tried to erase it.
It started with a list, harmless on the surface, names of nobles, trusted servants, a few musicians who knew when to play louder and when to stop. The invitations went out without seals, hand-delivered after Vespers, folded twice, never thrice. Everyone knew the rule: arrive separately, leave together, say nothing. By sunset, the Vatican's outer courtyards were empty, but the inner halls were glowing like embers. Candles lined the marble corridors in pairs, a quiet signal to those who understood. In the kitchens, the staff worked in careful silence, not a feast for pilgrims, a feast for power. Silver trays piled with rare fruits in winter, wine so dark it looked like ink, and spiced dishes meant to cloud the head and quicken the pulse. Servants were told to keep their eyes down and their ears closed. They tried, most failed. And then came the guests, silk brushing stone, perfume slicing through the air sharper than any blade. Cardinals smiling with the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. Courtiers who owed everything to a favor granted behind a closed door. Foreign envoys who swore they were only there to observe. Everyone pretending this was just another private supper, nothing to see, nothing to remember. But there was always someone watching. A clerk who slipped through with the accounts ledger and never forgot the numbers. A musician who kept time for the dancers and kept secrets for himself. A scribe who wrote a bland report for his master, and a second report, hidden, for history. They called it a banquet, as if bread and meat were the point. It was something else. A test. Who would flatter? Who would bend? Who would trade conscience for closeness to the throne? And who would refuse, and learn what refusal costs? The rules were simple. No titles after midnight, no lectures about morality, no mention of doctrine while the music played. But rules bend when power is in the room. Toasts got bolder, jokes sharpened like knives. The line between devotion and indulgence blurred in front of everyone's eyes. Some swore the whole thing was political theater, a loyalty ritual dressed up as pleasure. Others whispered it was proof that the shepherds had turned into wolves. No one agreed on the details later. Everyone agreed on the feeling, a hush that tasted like scandal. By dawn, the marble floors glittered with fallen wax and crushed petals. Servants moved like ghosts, wiping away the night. Contracts had been promised, alliances sealed with a glance, enemies marked by a raised eyebrow. The official log for that date? Empty. Private devotional gathering, it said. As if a few prayers and a little music were all that happened. The city woke to rumors anyway. Rome always does. But the names were never spoken aloud in public. They lived in margins, in footnotes, in letters written in careful code. Years later, when the clergymen involved had either risen higher or vanished entirely, a single phrase kept returning in foreign reports: the night Rome pretended not to see, not because the truth was invisible, but because too many people had looked straight at it and decided to look away. October 1501. The Vatican palace glowed like a furnace. Outside, pilgrims prayed in candlelight, believing they were close to heaven. Inside, the Pope prepared something no prayer could cleanse. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, and his rule was already whispered about in every alley of Rome. Nepotism, greed, poisonings, endless rumors. But that night, something darker would be remembered forever, even when the Church tried to erase it. The witnesses gave it a name: the Banquet of Chestnuts. A feast staged not for God, but for a man who thought himself untouchable. Candles dripped wax onto golden platters. Musicians played while servants carried in silver dishes overflowing with roasted meats, fruits, and wine. But the food was only a prelude. The real performance began when the Pope's guests arrived. Cardinals, nobles, and chosen favorites who knew that refusing an invitation could mean exile or worse. What happened next was recorded in hushed Latin by Johann Burckhardt, the Pope's own master of ceremonies, a man whose job was to note every ritual of the papacy with precision. His diary should have been a record of holy liturgy. Instead, for that night, it became a witness list of something unspeakable. He wrote of feasting that blurred into frenzy. He wrote of games staged in the candlelight, where power and shame mixed together. And most chilling of all, he wrote of the Pope watching, as if judgment no longer came from heaven, but from his throne. Some said Burckhardt exaggerated, that he hated the Borgias and wanted to stain their name forever. Others said he softened the truth, leaving out details that even he could not bear to write. Either way, the record exists. One Vatican official, trapped in duty, writing down a night the Church would later pretend never happened. That diary was copied, hidden, smuggled, and quoted for centuries, surviving every attempt to destroy it. The very fact that the Church tried to erase it only made it more famous, for if there was nothing to hide, why bury it so deep? Picture the contrast. Pilgrims kneeling in the square, whispering rosaries, while only a few walls away, the men who claimed to lead them turned devotion into theater. Was it corruption? Was it ritual? Or was it simply power, unmasked, Rome showing its true face under candlelight? Whatever it was, everyone who heard the rumor remembered the same phrase, the banquet of chestnuts. A name that outlived its witnesses, its pope, and even its century. A shadow, carved into history itself.
Rome, the year 955. The papal palace was less a house of God and more a fortress of politics. At its center sat a boy, only 18, crowned as Pope John XII. His election wasn't about holiness, it was about family power. The Crescenti and Tuscolani clans ruled Rome like rival mafias, and they placed him on the throne as their pawn. But pawns sometimes decide they like being kings. At first, John played the role expected of him. He wore the robes, he blessed the crowds, he spoke the Latin prayers. But behind the marble doors, his rule looked nothing like devotion. Ancient chroniclers write with clenched pens, calling him a man who turned the Lateran palace into a brothel. Harsh words, but they were his contemporaries, men who could not believe what they saw with their own eyes. He sold Foley offices for gold, not quietly, not subtly, but openly. A bishopric here, a monastery there, exchanged like coins at a market. To him, the sacred keys of Peter were bargaining chips. Loyalty could be bought. Forgiveness could be rented. Salvation could be negotiated. And with each deal, the treasury swelled while the church's soul drained away. But it wasn't only money. Rumors spread of feasts where vows were mocked, where priests became actors in games meant to shame the faith they claimed. When Roman nobles tried to confront him, he threatened them with curses, not spiritual, but political, backed by German mercenaries in his pay. One chronicler, Luitprand of Cremona, wrote with both disgust and fascination. He was a lover of hunting, of women, and of wine. He did not cease to commit homicide and perjury, even calling upon demons for counsel. Exaggeration? Maybe. But exaggeration only works if there is a spark of truth behind it. And the spark caught flame. By 963, Emperor Otto I, a man who saw himself as the new Charlemagne, rode into Rome with an army, demanding the Pope answer for his sins. Imagine the Lateran halls filled with bishops, each one forced to speak against the man they once called Holy Father. The charges read out like a parody of commandment breaking,
simony, sacrilege, blasphemy, even invoking pagan gods in private rites. John XII fled the city before the trial ended, abandoning his throne like a thief escaping his own house. But fate has a sense of irony. Months later, he returned, retaking the papacy by force. His end came not at the hands of soldiers or assassins, but in whispers, that he died in the bed of another man's wife, struck down either by her husband or by divine wrath itself. The records disagree, but they agree on this. His death was as scandalous as his life, a pope who treated heaven as a marketplace and left behind a question too sharp to ignore. If the shepherd lives like the wolf, what becomes of the flock?
It is the year 1032. Rome's streets are buzzing with gossip. The new pope has been crowned. But instead of solemn hymns, the whispers are about his age, barely 20 years old. His name, Benedict IX. His family, the powerful Tusculani clan, had bought his election the way others might buy a horse, and what followed was not a papacy, it was a carnival of disgrace. Chroniclers write that the Lateran Palace became a stage for his appetites. He was accused of every sin imaginable, from feasting while famine gripped Rome to turning holy offices into bargaining chips. Priests muttered that under his rule, the papacy itself became a marketplace. But the worst accusation was whispered in candlelit corners, that Benedict treated the papal crown not as sacred, but as property he could trade. In 1045, the unthinkable happened. Weary of the burdens of office, or perhaps lured by money, Benedict IX agreed to resign. Not for penance, not for prayer, but for gold. He literally sold the papacy to his godfather, the archpriest John Gratian, who became Pope Gregory VI. Imagine it, the throne of St. Peter, the keys of heaven itself transferred like a merchant deal, a pope who put a price tag on salvation. And yet, Benedict was not done. Months later, he tried to seize the papacy back, then again years later. 3 times he wore the tiara, 3 times Rome watched in shame. The Council of Sutri in 1046 finally ended the farce, deposing him as unworthy. But the damage was done. For centuries afterward, his name was a curse, a shorthand for corruption too blatant to be hidden. If Alexander VI was remembered for lust and John XII for violence, Benedict IX was remembered for something colder, greed. He proved that the papacy itself could be bought and sold like cattle. And once you admit that, the illusion of divine authority begins to crack.
Scandals alone do not destroy an empire. What destroys it is scandal remembered. And the Vatican learned early that memory could be managed. Not with swords, not with prisons, but with ink and silence. Look at Alexander VI. The banquet of chestnuts was written down in Burchard's diary, but later church historians dismissed it as rumor. Conveniently, many copies disappeared. If it was only gossip, why burn the pages? Why erase the witnesses? Because erasure itself is a confession. Or John XII. He was accused of murder, incest, blasphemy. Chroniclers called him the very spawn of hell. But instead of admitting that the office of pope allowed such a monster, the church reframed him as an outlier, a freak accident. He was remembered as an exception, not as proof of a system that enabled him. And Benedict IX, the pope who literally sold the papacy. Later, Catholic writers described him with gentle phrases, worldly, unfortunate. But he was not just unfortunate. He put a price tag on heaven. The cover-up was not to deny the sale, it was to soften the words. If the pope who sold salvation could be excused with polite adjectives, then the papacy itself could remain untouchable. This became the Vatican strategy. Not open denial, not complete silence, but containment. Scandals were reshaped with careful words. A pope was misled, another unworthy, another unfortunate.
mild labels for acts that shook Rome to its core. Language became the shield of power. But whispers live longer than decrees. Pilgrims carried the tales. Enemies of Rome repeated them. Reformers in later centuries pointed to these very scandals as proof that the papacy was not holy, but human, that it was less the throne of saints than the theater of sin. Imagine the Vatican archives. Shelves of glowing saints' lives, miracle tales, triumphs of faith. But deeper inside, locked behind doors, lie fragile manuscripts that tell a different story. Stories of nights the church would rather forget. Stories of power turned upside down. Each sealed manuscript is an admission. There is something worth hiding.
Centuries have passed since Alexander VI feasted in the Vatican, since John XII turned the Lateran into a brothel, since Benedict IX sold the papacy itself. The men are gone. The palaces remain. Their names survive mostly in footnotes tucked behind safer tales of holy popes and shining saints. But silence has a cost. Every cover-up leaves a shadow. Every excused scandal becomes a precedent. And when patterns of abuse are hidden, they do not vanish. They return, generation after generation, each time harder to deny. Think of it, an institution that claims divine authority, yet once tolerated orgies in its halls, blood on its altars, gold exchanged for heaven's keys. If the office could survive that, then what else can it survive? What else can be explained away, softened, erased? The Vatican insists these were exceptions, monsters, embarrassments. But the deeper truth is more unsettling. The papacy has always carried both faces, the sacred and the profane. And the reason we know is not because the church wanted us to, but because fragments of evidence slipped through the cracks of silence. So when you walk through Rome today, past the marble basilicas, past the glowing icons and the endless candles, remember what lies beneath the stone. History is not only what is written, it is also what is hidden, what is burned, what is whispered in secret. The church survived its darkest scandals, but survival is not the same as innocence. And that is the final lesson. Power always seeks to protect itself, but the truth has a way of leaking through walls, through archives, through time itself. The candles may burn low, the ink may fade, but the questions remain, and so do the shadows.